More than 30 years ago, a man by the name of Thomas Sutherland was kidnapped while he was teaching at the American University in Beirut. And I remember it well because he was from Fort Collins, which is where I grew up. And it was hard to miss the big yellow ribbons that were tied around the trees that lined Main Street in Fort Collins and all across the CSU campus. And days turned into weeks, turned into months, turned into years that he was in captivity, with no communication with his family, no communication with the outside world. Those ribbons were all we had for hope that he was alive and well. So when the day came, rather unexpectedly, that his wife received word that he had been released, you can imagine she was a little bit skeptical. She had hope bubbling up inside that there was truth to it, but she held her emotions in check. Later that morning, she got a phone call from the State Department saying it was, in fact, true. He had been released. But it wasn't until she got on a plane from the United States to Germany, got off the plane on that tarmac, and flung herself into the arms of her husband that she really, truly believed that it was so. And Mr. Sutherland says he cannot even begin to put into words the joy at that reunion. Now imagine that scene times 10,000. That's what it must have felt like for Thomas. Thomas, who was a very loyal friend to Jesus, one of his inner circle, very compassionate, tight with Jesus. In one scene, the Bible even tells us that Thomas would go to death for Jesus. Jesus wanted to travel through a certain route to Judea, but the disciples were worried that he would be stoned to death if he traveled through this way. And when he insisted that this was the route they would go, Thomas turned to the other disciples and said, "Well, then let us go too, so that we can follow him to death." He was so committed to Jesus. And so imagine the range of emotions that he must have felt when he just happened to be somewhere else on that first Easter day when Jesus appeared to the disciples. He walked in to see the other disciples, elated, overjoyed, laughing, sharing stories about their encounter with Jesus, and he simply could not believe his eyes or his bad luck at having been left out of that experience. And so he says to them, "I don't believe it. I won't believe it unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands and touch his side. I simply will not believe it." Just like Mrs. Sutherland whose husband had been in captivity for nearly 7 years, I want to believe it, but until I see him and feel him and experience him, I just can't, not yet. You see, Thomas needs what the disciples have experienced. He needs his own personal encounter with Jesus. He feels cheated. He got gypped. He wasn't there when Jesus appeared. And he wants to experience that same joy, that same sense of peace that being with Jesus brings. On the night before Jesus died, you all know the story well, he had a meal with his disciples. And after the meal, as they sat around, keeping each other company, Jesus began speaking, telling his friends what they could expect when he was to be gone. And one of the simplest but most profoundly moving things that Jesus says is in the Gospel of John, chapter 14. He said to them, "Peace I leave you, my peace I give to you. Let not your hearts be troubled." It's a spectacular promise. This peace will assure the disciples of Jesus' presence even after he's gone. It will assure the disciples of his love and his support. "Peace I leave you," he said. And so it's no surprise when he enters that upper room that he greets them saying, "Peace be with you." Sometimes people are curious, in fact, why I decided to go into ministry, especially at my advanced age. And I think this gets to the heart of the answer: peace. Like a lot of you, I think that peace comes with our faith in a deep and profound way. And I know I've had experiences, and you probably have too, where there's just a deep sense of peace in our lives. A sense of knowing that, as one of my favorite quotes says, all will be well, and all will be well, and all manner of all things will be well. I love that quote. That's peace. And if I can share a little bit of that with somebody else, if you can share a little bit of that with somebody else, I will happily share that secret. And so, even though the way to peace is often through conflict and through strife and grief, it's always available through God. Peace I leave you, my peace I give to you, he said. You see, God is a relational God. One of the things I love is that God chose to encounter people as a man, somebody who could come here and be friends with us. He was friends with his disciples. He had deep and meaningful relationships on this earth. Because life, especially an abundant life that God promises, is dependent on our sense of belonging and connectivity. Right, Zach? This is Zach, in case you don't know Zach. Life, an abundant life, is dependent on our sense of belonging and connectivity. One of humans' basic needs, in fact, beyond food, shelter, and water and clothing, is to belong to something. A sense of belonging. Teens in particular are craving to be part of a community. That's why gangs continue to flourish the way that they do. Kids want to be part of something, part of a community. And if they don't find it at home, and they don't find it at school, and they can't find it at church, they're going to seek it out, sometimes even to their own detriment. Life is dependent on our sense of belonging and connectivity. And some of you might be thinking, okay, well, we're pretty connected. We're connected to our TVs, we're connected to our computers, we're connected to our phones, we're connected to our email, we're connected to social media. But God calls us to also be connected to God. God calls us to be connected to each other, in community, in relationship, and to God, because that's where that profound sense of peace comes from. Several years ago, a well-respected and well-known busy neurosurgeon was suddenly stricken with a form of meningitis that very suddenly, almost immediately took his life. Within hours of feeling just a little bit ill, he was in a coma. Doctors were completely baffled. His family was in desperate prayer trying to figure out what to do. And ultimately, later in the week, was faced with the heart-wrenching decision of whether or not to pull him from life support. The doctor, of course, was completely oblivious to all this as it happened around him. And after 7 days, when his physicians had said there was absolutely no chance he could survive this, there was no longer any brain activity, at the precise moment when his family was deep in prayer over the fate of their beloved, he woke up. His story is chronicled in the book Proof of Heaven, and he details his experience, which he says brought him to the very brink of eternity. And he describes in the book what he saw and, more importantly, what he felt. And I won't bother trying to recreate all of that for you here, the beautiful ways that he describes his encounter with the divine. But suffice it to say, it was a beautiful encounter. And although he was happy to be alive, and by the way, by all accounts, it was deemed a miraculous healing, he had absolutely no long-term side effects after having been in a near-death state in this coma for 7 days. He was up walking within hours. So though he was extremely happy to be alive, he was desperate to connect to that divine presence that he had felt on that side, back here on this side of life. And what's so compelling to me about his story is that he now spends 3 to 4 hours a day in meditation and prayer. He wants so much to reconnect to that divine presence of love. And even though he said he used to attend church fairly regularly, but in his own words, pretty laissez-faire, he now attends with a passion. He comes to church and sits through that worship engaged, fully engaged in worship, because he so wants to connect with God. Can you imagine if we had churches full of people with that kind of desire to connect to God? I think the room would be buzzing. I think we could feel that kind of energy. I wish I had that. It's easy for each new day to flow into the next, isn't it? We wake up, we make a pot of coffee, we go to the gym or not. We take the kids to school, take the dog for a walk, go to the grocery store, go to the gas station, pick up the laundry, squeeze in a trip to visit friends for lunch, check Facebook, check emails. We get up the next morning and we start over doing the same thing again. And suddenly, we're too busy to meet God. We lack silence. We lack time. We lack a simple appreciation of being in the present, the satisfaction of now. We think we'll find Jesus in church, but then we have these preconceived ideas of exactly how that should look, or how that should feel, or where that should be. We judge other Christians and think, no, that's not quite how we need to be encountering Jesus. We let our pride and our sometimes slightly inflated view of ourselves get in the way by thinking that we can handle everything without God. You see, there's no one right way to encounter God, but there are a whole lot of right ways not to. How you encounter Jesus is entirely up to you. But make no bones about it, the invitation is waiting. We actually don't know if Thomas ever touched the holes in Jesus' hands or reached out and touched his side. The Bible doesn't tell us that. It tells us that Jesus offers Thomas to touch him, and Thomas immediately exclaims, "My Lord and my God." Thomas sees God fully revealed in that moment. And the recognition that Jesus, who stands before him, is the God of the universe was probably pretty overwhelming. My Lord and my God. But did Thomas touch him? Or was seeing enough? Was hearing his voice enough? Was watching him walk through the locked door enough? Does it matter? How you encounter Jesus is entirely up to you. For Thomas, perhaps it wasn't the touching that led to his belief, but the simple invitation to encounter Jesus any way he wanted. Which leaves Jesus addressing a conundrum of sorts. Thomas, who has said he would not believe it unless he saw it with his own 2 eyes, is fortunate enough to see it with his own 2 eyes. But Jesus knows that that will not be the case for you and I. It won't be the way that it was for the disciples in the upper room. And so he says to Thomas, "You believe because you see. Blessed are those who will not see me and yet believe." This is not a rebuke of Thomas. We do him a disservice when we call him Doubting Thomas, or we assume that Jesus was scolding him for needing proof of the resurrection. And thank goodness it was not a rebuke, because I think any one of us, if faced with the same situation, would probably have said the same thing. Prove it. And so this is about hope and promise, not about judgment and reprimand. Jesus was looking out for you and me. We are blessed, he said. Belief is not to be limited to only those who get to see. All of us, all the millions upon millions of people who have walked this earth for the last 2,000 years are blessed when, without having seen the risen Christ with our own two eyes, we nevertheless believe. We are blessed. At the end of the day, this is not a story about doubt. It's a story about moving from unbelief to belief and coming to understand what that means for each one of us individually. How do we move from unbelief to belief? What do we need to get ourselves there? Thomas was just eager for his own encounter with Jesus, because in encountering Jesus, we strengthen our faith, which leads to the peace that Jesus promised, and it leads to wisdom and unspeakable joy, and eventually to abundant life. Amen.